I love this cartoon with Snoopy. Basically, this is probably the most famous quote for poor writing in the world. And it actually comes from a novel that was considered the worst novel ever published. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of contenders for that award, but it was a dark and stormy night. Virtually everybody knows from Snoopy and his endeavors to write, and often very poorly. And I use this to illustrate something that we know both empirically and for those of us who teach, we see this way too often. A lot of kids' writing isn't what it should be. This isn't just an issue in Canada. It isn't just an issue in North America. It's an issue worldwide. I mean, we see this in Chile. We see this in Norway. We see this in Africa. We see it in China. This is a problem across the world. It's pretty well recognized by governments and educational organizations and teachers around the globe. Slide, please. I want to give some examples of this that I've collected over time. And you see again Charlie Brown here. One example is, I am the best they is in English. Now, obviously, a comment like that, probably not. I love this next one. Think about what the world would be like if this is what Pavlov studied. Pavlov studied the salvation of dogs, a slight spelling error, and we get something that looks very different. Or the next one,
You're muted. You're muted, Steve.
Thank you. I was trying to move, give me a second. I'm trying to move a bar to make sure I can see the full screen. So it's okay. Let's go back to the screen. I can't see our screen. So can you guys see the screen?
Yes, we could see the screen. Now we don't.
You don't see the screen now. Okay. So give me a second. I'll see if I can bring it back up. Apologize for that. Hopefully this will be a simple.
Oh, it's up again.
Okay, is it up as it should be, or up 1, 2, 3, 4?
It's 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so let's try this.
But you can, it won't be a problem. You can start and go to that. We can still see the print, I think, Steve.
Okay, I apologize for that. The third one I've seen in various forms that's written here. Galileo is 1/2 Italian, 1/2 French, and 1/2 English. Obviously in this case, this is a mathematics problem.
Steve, we only see the first slide. You need to go to the third slide.
Okay, so let me do this. So can you see the third slide now?
Yes.
Okay, so if that's okay, we'll just proceed.
Yeah, that's fine. Just go to the third slide. Yeah.
Sorry about that. You won't hear me saying slide again then. And then finally, the last example here is poetry is when every line starts with a capital letter and doesn't reach the right side of the paper. Now, I particularly have this cartoon with Charlie Brown here, where he's saying, some days I feel like I'm riding uphill. Now, not every kid feels like that, obviously. Some kids feel very confident and very competent in terms of their writing, but we see too many kids who express in one way or the other this sentiment that Charlie Brown has. So, it raises a question, why is this the case? Why do so many kids have difficulty with writing? And there's a lot of possible reasons that we could put forward, but I'd like to share a couple. I don't think this covers everything, but one of the reasons I think our kids don't write as well as they should, or as well as they could, is that it's a school issue, okay? Some schools and some classrooms and some teachers do a phenomenal job of teaching writing. There's no question about that. We see that in survey studies and observational studies that we do and others do across the world. However, the predominant theme that we see when we ask teachers about how they teach writing is that what we walk away with is that students do very little writing at school. And this is from first grade all the way to 12th grade. Very little time is spent teaching writing. Writing is not a major aspect of the curriculum across the content areas. And I'll make the case for why that should change. And this is particularly damning for those of us who work at the university level in academia. Teachers indicate that their pre-service preparation is inadequate. And so let me give an example of this. We did a study a number of years ago where we asked English teachers, a random sample from across the US. So this may not apply in Canada, but it certainly applies to your southern border. 72% of English teachers said their preparation to teach writing from the coursework that they took as undergraduate students in English programs and education programs was inadequate. I mean, that just blew my mind away when I saw that. So I think that's a real indictment of what we're doing at the university level to prepare teachers to be effective in terms of teaching writing and making writing part of what happens in terms of education and content areas. Also, when we ask teachers about their in-service preparation, there's a little bit more variability here. They're a little bit more positive, but the reality is they're often relatively negative about the in-service preparation they get. And there's a lot of different reasons for that, if somebody wants to ask a question, I'd be glad to answer. I want to share a quote by William Ward, the novelist, which I think provides some direction in terms of thinking about, what is good teaching and what is good writing instruction. He basically said the good teacher explains. Yeah, that's true. The superior teacher demonstrates, and I think that's even more true. They model, they show. The great teacher inspires. And really, that's what we want, is we want great teachers who not only explain and demonstrate, but inspire kids to be the best writers they can be, and kids who feel competent in their writing and competent and who like to write. Now, I want to just take a sidestep here for a second. Don't get me wrong about this. When kids come to school, almost every kid likes to write, enjoys writing, is positive writing. Somewhere over time, starting in first grade, that attitude about writing starts to decline. In reading, it stays pretty flat. They're already positive about reading. It maintains itself. Writing for most kids starts to see a decline in this. And so, it begs the question, what is our goal in terms of writing instruction for kids? Obviously, we want them to write as well as they can, every kid to reach their potential as writers. But we also want to be sure that this becomes a tool that they will use in the future. And that centers around their beliefs about writing, its value, its importance, their competence, their identity as writers. We don't want to forget that. And that's part of what the Great Teachers Inspires is about, is instilling beliefs that I can, I will, and I'm excellent at doing this. So in a sense, we want teachers in schools who inspire our children to be the best writers they can be. Now, I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about what we know from research that would give us some guidance in terms of teaching writing. And I always like to share what my sources are when I do this. So over the years, we've conducted three kinds of looks at the writing literature. One is we've looked at those kind of traditional studies where you have a treatment condition where students get some kind of instruction in writing, and they're compared to either an alternative writing instruction or a control group. Those are typically true experiments or randomized controlled design trials or quasi experiments. And so for those, we've looked at hundreds and hundreds of those, and we've computed effect sizes, which I will not be talking about effect sizes today. And you might be saying, thank God. We've also looked at what are called single case design studies, which also allow you to draw some causal statements about what works and what doesn't. And we've also done a look at qualitative studies that have been conducted with exceptional literacy teachers to see what trends, what exists, what they do when they teach writing. So we've tried to bring these three types of information together. And here's the really good news. They pretty much corroborate each other. So what we see in research with group studies, true experiments and quasi-experiments, single case studies, and what exceptional teachers do, it overlaps and reinforces the other. And there's 5 basic themes that we can draw from this kind of at a general level, and this is basically, if you said to me, if I was looking at your writing program or you were looking at a program I developed, you should be able to see these things. Kids need to write. We need to teach. We need to support kids as they write. We need to connect writing with reading and learning. And the last one is only from teachers, for the most part, that were exceptional literacy teachers, because this is really hard to do in an experimental study. We need to create classrooms where students can thrive as writers and they're supported. And this goes to my last point about developing students who are inspired. So I'm going to work our way through each of these and give more concrete examples. And the other thing that I'll be doing as I do this is you'll see percentile points. So I said I wasn't going to do effect sizes, but I am going to share with you what kind of jump in percentile points that you might expect. And the way to think about this, if a kid was at, the 50th percentile, or you had an average class and you engaged in this, you might expect, a 5 percentile point in your students' writing performance, a 12%, a 15%, but I won't dwell on these. You can see what the effects might be. And I want to give 2 caveats before I get started. One is that I would love to say to you, we know all there is to know about teaching writing. That's not the case. I'd be foolish if I said something like that to you. We know enough that we can structure what's really important at this point in terms of improving and helping students advance as writers. And we have a lot of examples of things that will make this work, that have evidence to show that they're effective. That isn't to say, and it's not to diminish, the skills and knowledge that you've acquired as a teacher. You know what works for you within your classrooms, what works with your students. The basic idea behind evidence-based practice is to apply the best scientific evidence available within the context within which you work. So I want to say as a caveat first, please think about this in the context of your own students, your own skills, and your own writing program. These are all important things that work, but we're not 100% certain they work with your students because they weren't exactly tested with your kids. Another point that I'd like to make is that with any evidence-based practice, basically what we have is information that it works with somebody across multiple studies. But when you apply these practices, it's good for you to check to make sure that it's working with your students. So in a sense, these 2 things basically dovetail together. Okay, so if we increase how much students write, we get about a 12 percentile jump in the quality of their writing. Now this actually is a twofer. When we increase how much students write, at least at the elementary grades, we also get about a 1/4 of a standard deviation jump in their reading comprehension on norm reference tests. Anytime you move the needle on a norm reference test, that's a big deal. So you get kind of a carryover to that. Now you might ask, well, how much? I used to go into meetings with doing workshops, and I would just blithely say double the amount of time that students write. And the reason is that I never actually knew how much individual teachers were having their kids write. But in this case, if you increase by about 45 minutes per week how much your students writing, then you get a positive impact. Now, if your kids are already writing a lot already, yeah, you probably won't get that same impact. The important point here is that a critical aspect of a good writing program is that kids have to write. That's basically the game. That's what they're doing this for. And we want them to do it starting in preschool and moving all the way through high school. So a couple of action steps to think about. I have to say the first action step here is not evidence-based. It was based from the What Works Clearinghouse Guide to Elementary Writing Instruction, and this was based on the opinions of experts in writing at the time, and there were about 6 or 7 people. But I agree. Now, I was one of the experts, so obviously I'm going to agree with this. But at least 30 minutes a day should be dedicated to teaching writing and 30 minutes used for writing. Now, that doesn't mean every day has to be 30-30, but on an average, you'd like to devote about an hour a day. Now, that can include writing done in content areas as well. And that's the second point here. Integrate writing practices into other content area instructions to address the time constraints that often face you as a teacher in terms of finding enough time in an extremely busy day where we're expected to do more and more as teachers in terms of what we teach. So we need to be creative if we're going to meet this kind of hour a day, and mandate's not quite the right word for it, but this goal that we hope that we can achieve. Another thing in terms of thinking about this is that when I say kids need to write, it's not just writing anything. We want to help them understand the different purposes of writing. And so I think Michael probably talked to this to some degree previously. When we talk about different genres, they serve different purposes. They have different structural ways of being put together. Students need to understand why we write, what the purposes are, and how the different kinds of writing are put together. And, I'll talk a little bit about this later in terms of how we kind of do this in some of the work we do. And the other thing, I cannot say this strongly enough, we need to make sure that students are writing for real purposes. I was once working with a material developer, and they had, an activity, a couple of lessons devoted to writing letters. And they were letters that never went anywhere. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. You're going to have a kid write a letter and learn the structure of, a formal letter or personal letters, then send it, make it real, have a real audience. I'll give another example of this. My daughter went to a Quaker school in the Washington, D.C. area, and they were great at having real audiences for what you wrote. So one of the things that they did when they were in 5th grade, and every school basically in Virginia, Maryland, DC, and Delaware does this at some point, they saved the Chesapeake Bay. And so her school saved, that was their idea, and they decided that they would clean up a creek that ran behind the school and behind the University of Maryland where I was teaching at the time. And so obviously this doesn't sound a whole lot like writing at this point, but the school or the class or a particular class wrote two letters to the university newspaper, a letter to the Washington Post, and 2 letters to the College Park newspaper. Now, the Washington Post letter was never published, but the other 4 were. They wrote a grant collectively that they submitted to the College Park government that was funded. They wrote letters that were stuffed in mailboxes to all the neighbors in the neighborhoods surrounding the school and that abutted the lake. They also held rallies where they, wrote slogans and stuff. So something that doesn't sound like writing, but had a real purpose, had tons of writing in it. And I'll tell you, the teacher just basically had to get out of their way, and they were all over this. They saw it as something real, something that had a purpose, something that they wanted to do. So as much as we can make our writing have real purposes and real audiences, the better. Another action step to think about this, and you'll notice that there's a percentile jump point here. This is basically steps to what we think of as writer's workshop or process approach to writing. What we do is we extend to students opportunities for writing for longer periods of time, where you might be working on a piece, not for a day or a class, but across weeks. It doesn't mean all your writing assignments like that, but students have extended opportunities for writing. As I mentioned before, there's an emphasis on writing for real audiences, particularly in terms of the process approach in writing workshops. Kids are encouraged to be engaged in cycles of planning, transcribing or writing their text, reviewing, revising, editing, and publishing. And there's a premium placed upon personal responsibility and ownership. That, for example, when we give feedback to students, we keep in mind that it's their writing, we're giving suggestions, and the writer needs to take responsibility and be thoughtful in terms of the types of revisions they make. So when we see this kind of approach put into place, we see a positive jump. Now, I want to say to you what's missing here. So if you think about the teacher's college approach that's been used so widely in reading and writing in North America generally, what we see less of in this is actual teaching. Now, some of the programs coming out of TC now have emphasized that a little bit more, but probably, in my personal opinion, not enough. And I'll give an example of this when we talk about teaching strategies for planning and revising to students, which will be the next thing that we address. Okay, so I'm making a transition here. Students need to write, and we need to teach. And I want to share with you the things that we know if we teach and how we do it that have a positive effect on students' writing. And teaching writing strategies goes all the way from first grade to 12th grade. So obviously, if you're teaching a very simple planning strategy, it might just be brainstorming ideas in kindergarten and first grade, but it's going to be much more sophisticated as kids get older. Basically, teaching in this case involves explicitly and systematically. So that means, modeling, practicing, and providing systematic instruction. So you have a planned out instruction for teaching strategies for planning, revising, or editing. And, basically, I think there's a couple of ways of thinking about these strategies, and I'm going to give some examples of these, is that they can be general, like something like brainstorming or semantic webbing, where you have a central idea and you have, kind of ideas related to that going off in spokes. But often the strategies that are taught tend to be genre specific. So what they're taking advantage of is the fact that specific genres have kind of a common way or common elements used for structuring the message. That's the case for stories, it's the case for arguments, etc. The other thing that's very important in this, and this is often missing in many materials, is that instruction is designed to teach students to use the strategies independently. So, the end point here is that the kid can use this, and maybe you need to step in every now and then and remind them about something or give them some assistance if they need it. But the idea is for them to be independent strategy users. And as I mentioned, strategies can range from processes such as brainstorming, to strategies that are genre specific. Now look at that percentile point, 35 percentile point jump in writing quality. That's huge. There's not going to be anything else I talk about that's going to have quite this jump. Now, please don't do what I've seen happen sometimes when I present this. People think that, oh, that's all I need to do. Well, there's a lot more that needs to happen to become a good writer than just be strategic or be, more facile with the thinking aspects of writing. So a couple of things to consider in this. We want to teach strategies for the various components of the writing process: planning, revising, editing, etc. We also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, we want to use a gradual release model. so that we initially explain, we present the strategy, we explain its purpose, how you use it, when you use it, where you use it. We take questions. We may even modify it based on students' suggestions at that point that we try out. We model how to do it, and students get practice until they can do that independently. Now, if we're going to teach more than one writing strategy, which I think is very important, we want to give students the power to select and use appropriate writing strategies. So as students start building a repertoire of strategies, they have to be strategic in terms of thinking about, okay, I need to use this strategy here, or I might need to modify it for this particular use. And so that comes to the last point, is we want to encourage students to be flexible in their use of the components of the writing process. So, with this last one, there are times when we need to plan. We teach kids strategies for plan. There are times we don't. If I'm writing a note to my wife that I've gone to play basketball, I don't need to write the next great masterpiece. I just need to say, gone to play ball, be back at 6:30. So we also want students to be flexible in terms of thinking about when they use these particular strategies. Okay, so some examples of strategies, and we'll move from some very simple ones to a little bit more difficult ones. So, a very simple one that you often see people use is that if they're describing something, we ask them before they start writing to think about, what did you see? How did it look? What sounds did you hear? What did you touch? What could you smell? What did you taste? And this could be done as a general discussion. It could be done where students write out ideas in note form before they start, but this is appropriate, really for about grades K through 3. A more sophisticated one that we'll talk about even more in a little bit, that we've used in grades 2 and 3, and we've even seen used with college students, which I think is a little inappropriate, who are learning English, is the TREE strategy. And basically, TREE is just a mnemonic for helping kids remember, basically, what they need to do. They need to tell what they believe. So when they're planning, they think about what they're, what they believe, what they're going to be defending. Then we ask, they need to provide 3 or more reasons. So they brainstorm reasons, or they go to content material to find reasons, but at least have 3 reasons for that are strong, that support what they believe. And, you need to end it and wrap it up right and examine if I have all my parts. Now, if we were doing this in 3rd grade, that 3rd E down, or that 3rd point down, the first E would be to give an example, and the 4th E down would be to end it. So there wouldn't be this examine part. But this is basically a strategy that gets you to think about, okay, what do I believe up front? Make a decision, provide the reasons for it, and wrap it up right. So, and examine to make sure I have all the things. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, another strategy for persuasive writing, which is much more difficult, and this really is from about 5th grade and can be modified up to about 12th grade, is STOP. And it's a strategy along with TREE that I developed. STOP was developed with Sue de la Paz. Basically, in this case, what we wanted to have happen, and I don't think this did, so this is always an there's always unintended consequences. We ask kids to suspend judgment before they take a side position, and so we ask them to think about both sides of the topic. And so we ask them to brainstorm, and this can be done collectively as a class, it can be done in pairs, it can be done individually. They basically list ideas for and against, and it could be that there's more than 2 positions, but they list all the ideas down. And then they have this kind of checklist. Did I list ideas for each side? Can I think of anything else? And, again, another point. So we're just trying to get them to get ideas out. And then we ask them to take a side. And so, they've listed on a sheet, let's say just pros and cons, if you'd like, and they read down through those, and, they look at what they think is their best argument, and they pick a side, and then they take a look and they see which are my strongest points for my position, and they put a plus by them. We also have asked them to look at the ideas on the other side that's most important for them to address, and they may plus by that. So then we ask them to organize their ideas. So they put a star next to each idea they want to use, and the ones that they want to refute, they do the same thing. And then they do an initial organizational plan by numbering. So if they have like 4 stars on the pro side and 3 stars on the refute side, then what they're going to do is they have to decide, do they want to present all the pros first? And that might be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7 for the cons, or they might, alternate in some way, but they have to think about the organization. And then we always do this, is plan more as you write. One of the things that we find is that students use strategies and they do their planning up front before they write. Many kids stop planning as they write, and that's definitely not what we want to have happen. And then once they're done with their essay, their first part, we ask them to go back. So the strategy is actually named Stop and Dare. Look to see if you developed your topic sentence in a way that's understandable. Look to see if you can add any supporting ideas or details. Look to see how well you've rejected arguments on the other side. Make sure you've ended with a powerful conclusion. So that would be a much more sophisticated strategy, and that could be adapted upwards, say for high school students, by adding on, considering your context as a starting point when you start your essay, because often if you don't give the context for an argument, it's going to be very difficult for the person who's reading it. Now, I also had mentioned the tree strategy to you earlier, so I want to give another example of this. There's actually 3 strategies in this particular situation that we taught to 4th grade kids, and this was kids with disabilities. So this is a pretty complex thing that what I'm talking about here, and I'll talk a little bit more about how the instruction went. And this is using the self-regulated strategy development model, which my wife, Karen Harris, developed, and I'll recommend some resources for that in a few minutes. But there were 3 strategies that we wanted students to learn. And so the first one was the power strategy. And so in this particular study, in this case, we didn't concentrate on revising and editing after the draft was done. We just focused on these 3 strategies, and then came back in later once students were able to do this successfully and added back in revising. So we put on pause revising and editing. So we have this kind of general strategy called POW, and if we were to use revising and editing, it would be POWRE, P-O-W-R-E, revise and then edit. But basically the first part, is you've got to pick your ideas and organize your notes. That's really planning, okay? And that's what TREE, which we're going to look at again in a second, helps you do. And then remember, I said we always say write and say more. And we make sure kids know that this POW or POWRE, if we're doing that, can be used with any kind of writing. It's not genre specific. But in this case, we were interested in helping students respond to an issue and write their opinion about it. And so we use TREE, which I introduced earlier. And part of the reason that we use the TREE mnemonic and then we use a visual of it is to help students remember what the elements are. It's a mnemonic, it's not the strategy, it's just a way of remembering. And so in this case, you have your topic sentence that tells what you believe, your reasons, explain your reasons, and then your ending. And so we tell the students that your reasons are like the trunk of the tree. If they're really solid and strong, then your tree, your topic sentence, is going to do really well. And the same thing in terms of explaining the reasons, and the ending is what holds it all up at the end. So just a way of helping students remember or conceptualize. Now, in this particular instance, we also, and I'm going to move down one and then come back, we also were interested in students writing an opinion after reading text. So they were drawing upon source material. And we adapted a strategy that was developed by one of our students, Linda Mason, called TWA, think before, while, and after reading. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but you can see, there are various things that we taught and encouraged students to do as they were looking at the source material. And they're looking at this source material for specific things. So if you think about what will persuade your reader. So they're looking to understand the text read, but what can be gained from it for the topic that they're going to write. So I'm going to move back up a slide. So usually when we introduce a strategy, something like Tree here, you'll also see, some graphic organizer that helps students take their notes in. So I just wanted to share that with you. We moved from the graphic organizers and we faded out as students they don't need it anymore because they remember the steps and they make their own graphic organizer. And then this is an example of the informational text. It was about 4th to 5th grade level, approximately 300 words. In this particular case, we only worked on one source text at a time. And so here's kind of the end point where you see a student. You see their source text on the left. I know it's a little hard to see, but you see they've gone through and underlined and they've starred things that they could use in their writing. And then using what they know and what they pulled from text, they create their plan and they create it in note form. And then this kid has written their composition. And so that's what the end point would look like. Students operating without us saying, okay, use the strategy, etc. And you'll notice that they have POW on here and Tree, and most kids check off each step as they do them and use it as a way of checking back into their composition. That's something that we actually learned from kids to do early on. We started seeing kids do that without being prompted to do it. And we thought, well, that should be part of the strategy. That seems like a no-brainer. The SRSD model that I mentioned to you, it didn't come out quite exactly like I wanted on the strategies, the green one. But here's basically what we do. We have, if you look at the instructional stages, the first thing that we do is we make sure students have the background knowledge to use the strategies that we're teaching. So think about, we're teaching a strategy for writing a persuasive argument. Well, that means that students need to know what persuasive arguments are, what their basic elements are, because we need a common vocabulary to talk to each other with. So we're talking about reasons, we're talking about your topic sentence or your premise, we're talking about endings. So the way that we do that is we basically read text that are of that genre. And in this case, we created text that are appropriate for that grade level to read. And what students do is we go through some good examples and we talk about what makes this a good argument that's being put forward. But as the teachers, we're thinking we want to be sure that they get at that premise or topic sentence, that they can identify reasons and explanations and identify the ending. So they'll bring up other things. We'll list them on the board and they're important, but we're also going to make sure, even if we need to prompt, that they pick up the parts of Tree that we're going to be using. Once we do that, we present the strategy. We talk about it, what each step, say for Tree or POW, are going to do and why we use them and when and where we use them. And we take questions and we consider with the class if we need to make any modifications, and that's the discuss it part. Then we model how to use it. And the modeling basically is we'll have a topic that we're going to write about, and we have up, like the Tree graphic organizer that I showed you, and we'll walk students through the step, but they help us. They help generate the ideas. So if we were teaching this without, looking at source material, we'd just be generating ideas from our head. And that's, in terms of these three strategies here, we first teach students how to do POW and Tree. Once they do that, then we go back and we add the source material and TWA. So what we're doing here is we're leading the process, but students are helping us generate the information so they're actively involved. So they're not sitting there looking at us. And then what we do is we may model more than once, okay? Maybe 2-3 times, but we're giving control over to them. And once we feel that they're comfortable with that, then what we do is they just skip memorize it for a second. They move to support it. And we have kids work together to generate 1 or 2 arguments, and then they work to go independently. Now, what I want to point out here, is that we're not just doing this one time. We're modeling 2, 3 times. They're working on 3 or 4 or 5 arguments that they're doing. So they get considerable practice. And so this is one of the things that when you take a look, say, at the TC material, and I don't want to, I'm not purposely taking a shot at the TC material. If you look at Writer's Workshop and Mini Process Approach, you don't get this kind of concerted, systematic attempt to help kids master what they're learning to do in a particular genre or with particular strategies. And I think that this is one reason why this is so effective. Now, I want to go back to step 4, which is memorize it. So if you can't remember the steps of the strategy, you're unlikely to apply them. So this memorize it doesn't really occur here. It actually starts as soon as we introduce the strategy. Each day there might just be a little practice in terms of students sharing with each other what the steps of, say, TREE are and their purpose, or steps of POW, etc., until they don't even think about it anymore, and it just drops out. So it's not really a step by itself. And obviously, maybe I shouldn't say obviously, the way that we kind of approach this is, let's say that we model and we move to students practicing together, and we notice that kids really aren't ready for that. We'll go back and model again, or maybe some kids need another modeling. So this is meant to be recursive and flexible in terms of its use. Now, you'll also notice over on to the right side, self-regulation. Well, I haven't talked about that. I mean, obviously the strategies help you self-regulate your behavior, but we've also built into SRSD the following self-regulation components. There could be others. And so one is goal setting. So let me give some examples of that. So when I model how to use TREE, we'll set a goal to get all those parts of TREE in there. And then we'll go back and we'll monitor and check to see that we did, okay? And that will continue throughout as students use the strategy. And one of the things that will happen with that is that we'll have students actually self-record that. They may have, little kids may have a rocket chart so they can show all their parts. And guess what? If I'm modeling, you can bet we're going to get all the parts in there. And so I keep supporting them. And so their performance stays high on that. And whenever we conference with them, we talk about why they're doing so well when they look at their graphs. And we make sure that what gets emphasized is use of the strategy and student effort. We'll also use goal setting for students to select something that they're learning that they can apply in a different place. So it moves outside of our context of our classroom. And so often we'll do that with kids in pairs. So they'll say, okay, here's something that I'd like to try out that I'm learning here. And it could be goal setting as an example of that. And they'll try it out in a different setting, but they'll talk about how they might need to do that or modify it for that setting. And then a day later or 2 days later, they come in and say, well, it worked, it didn't work, here's what I think, etc. But we try to move it outside of the context of the classroom. Sometimes goal setting is used for high flyers, so that, they already know how to write a pretty good argumentative essay. So we want them to be doing other things. And so we set personalized goals with them. We also look to have kids self-reinforce. So one of the things that especially with kids with special needs, we may have them generate with us a list of words or things that they can say when they really like something, or a way of rewarding themselves. And self-statements are the same thing. If we have a kid with ADHD, sometimes we'll use something like just, think like a turtle. Just, something that will help them slow down. One kid I saw one time had the saying that his teacher helped him, I won't get mad. Mad makes me do bad, because he'd get frustrated real easily. And I was observing the classroom, and he'd push away from it, and I'd hear him say that, and then he'd go back and start to work and push away again. But in each of these cases, what the teachers did is they identified everybody needs one thing, they say to themselves sometimes. And every kid in the class identified that, and then they made a tree with it, and they helped reinforce the use of it across the classroom for each kid. And that's kind of, you can see different kinds of self-statements here: problem definition, focus and attention, the strategies, this one's for TWA, self-evaluation, error correction, coping and self-control. and self-reinforcement. These are all statements that kids have generated that we've worked with.